Henry Phipps Junior was born in Philadelphia in 1839 to an English shoemaker. When the family moved to Pittsburgh in 1845, they settled at 340 Rebecca Avenue in Allegheny City. The Carnegies, recent Scottish immigrants, also working class, also scrambling, arrived in 1848 and settled just 2 doors down at 336 Rebecca. The friendship that started between those two row houses would produce, over the following 50 years, one of the largest private fortunes in American history. Phipps left school at 13, earning $1.25 a week at a jewelry store before taking night accounting courses and landing a bookkeeper's job. By his 20s, he was Carnegie's partner in iron. By 1892, when Carnegie Steel was formally organized with $25 million in capital, Carnegie held $13.8 million in shares. Phipps held $2.75 million, tied for second with Henry Clay Frick, behind only Carnegie. Carnegie called him his money-getter. A journalist's assessment went further. Phipps' career, wrote muckraker James H. Bridge, is without parallel for a man as successful as he has been. He never made an enemy, nor lost a friend. When J.P. Morgan bought Carnegie Steel for $400 million in 1901, folding it into the newly formed United States Steel Corporation, Carnegie took $226 million. Phipps, who held 11% of the company, received $48 million. A reporter caught him leaving. Asked for a statement on the largest private steel transaction in history, Henry Phipps Jr. delivered 4 words: "Ain't Andy wonderful?" That was the full press statement. That was the public voice of one of America's wealthiest men, standing beside a 9-figure payout, deflecting credit to someone else as a reflexive habit. He spent the rest of his life doing the same thing. The Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh's Schenley Park was his 1893 gift to the city, one of the largest glass botanical houses in America. A $1 million grant from Phipps in 1903 founded the Henry Phipps Institute in Philadelphia, dedicated to tuberculosis research. In 1907, he established Bessemer Trust Company to manage the family fortune across generations. He refused all interview requests. He kept his philanthropies private. Unlike Carnegie, his granddaughter would later write, Harry shunned all publicity about his personal life and philanthropies. He died in Great Neck, New York, on September 22, 1930, at 91. His probate estate was worth just over $3 million, a figure that reflects how thoroughly he had already transferred his assets to trusts and children during his lifetime. He had 4 children. His sons, John and Howard, are the ones you find in financial and architectural histories. John Schaefer Phipps built Westbury House, which his daughter Peggy Phipps Bogner eventually opened as Old Westbury Gardens. Howard ran Bessemer Trust. The daughters are harder to find. Their names were Amy and Helen, and they lived in the slipstream of their father's deliberate obscurity until the historical record absorbed them into it permanently. Amy Phipps was born in Pittsburgh on December 7, 1872. Helen Margaret Phipps followed on July 3, 1876. Both grew up inside the specific social universe of the Gilded Age's very wealthy. Transatlantic travel, European finishing, and the careful management of whom one might eventually marry. The Phipps fortune gave them every option available to women of their class and era. The era defined what those options were. For wealthy American daughters in the 1890s and early 1900s, the most prestigious option was a transatlantic marriage. British and European aristocratic families, asset-rich and cash-poor after decades of agricultural decline, found that American industrial heiresses came with fortunes large enough to restore estates and maintain titles. American families discovered that a daughter married into the British establishment was the closest thing to a coat of arms that new money could buy. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 100 American women married into the British peerage. The Phipps sisters were two of them. Helen went first, on November 2, 1904, at Kiltarledy Parish Church in Inverness Shire, Scotland. Her groom was Bradley Martin Jr. The reception was held at nearby Beaufort Castle, the Phipps family having leased it for several years. Bradley Martin Jr. was presentable, patrician, and heir to a family name that had spent 7 years recovering from the most talked-about party in American history. His parents, Cornelia and Bradley Martin Sr., had hosted the Bradley Martin Ball at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City on February 10, 1897. 800 guests arrived in costume: French kings, Elizabethan courtiers, Mary Queen of Scots. The bill came to roughly $400,000. The backlash was immediate and loud. Ministers delivered sermons against it. The city of New York raised the Martins' property taxes to punitive levels in direct response. The family retreated to their Scottish estate, Balmacon, 65,000 acres in Inverness, and by 1899 had taken up permanent residence in Britain. They never came back. Helen married their son 5 years after that exile. Bradley Martin Jr. hadn't thrown the ball. He was 24 when it happened. But the family's reputation for spectacular excess without consequence colored his social identity. His recorded recreations: shooting, fishing, motoring, traveling, deer stalking. He outlived his wife by nearly 30 years. The couple settled at Knoll in Old Westbury, Long Island. Henry Phipps purchased the estate in 1910 for his daughter and son-in-law's use, and calling it a gesture understates the scale of what he was giving. Knoll was 40,000 square feet of Palladian architecture, designed in 1903 by Carrere and Hastings, the same firm that designed the Frick Collection and the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. It had originally been built for a horse breeder named Herman Duryea before passing to the Phipps family. 4 sons were born to Helen and Bradley at Knoll: Henry Bradley Martin, twins Esmond and Alistair, and Howard Townsend Martin. The estate held the family for nearly a century. What Helen's daily life inside those 40,000 square feet looked like in granular detail is largely undocumented, which is itself the point. The historical record of the Gilded Age's great estates preserves the architecture, the guest lists, the menus, the servants' uniforms. The interior lives of the women who manage them are thin. Helen Phipps Martin raised 4 sons, hosted the society that her social position required, and moved between Long Island, London, and Scotland across 30 years of marriage. In March 1934, she was in Pasadena, California, when her appendix ruptured. She died on March 16, 1934. She was 57 years old. The New York Times ran the headline the following day: "Death takes wife of Bradley Martin. New York society woman is victim of appendicitis in Pasadena, California." The subhead: Henry Phipps's daughter. Wife of one man, daughter of another. 2 names in the headline, neither her own. Her mother, Anne Childs Schaefer Phipps, died that same October. The generation that had built and married into the fortune was gone. Knoll stayed in Martin family hands for another 70 years. The remaining 32 acres were listed for sale in 2002 at $16 million. A developer bought the property in 2004 for $11 million, intending subdivision. Nearly a century of Phipps Martin occupation, reduced to a real estate transaction. Amy's story requires a different kind of accounting. She married Frederick Edward Guest on June 28, 1905, at St. George's, Hanover Square, one of the most socially distinguished churches in London. The reception at Brooke House on Park Lane drew more than 1,000 guests. Frederick Guest was a British politician, a Liberal member of Parliament who would serve as chief whip of Lloyd George's coalition government from 1917 to 1921, then as Secretary of State for Air from 1921 to 1922. He was also Winston Churchill's first cousin. In 1904, Frederick had followed Churchill into the Liberal Party, and in 1906 became Churchill's private secretary in the Campbell-Bannerman government. When Amy and Frederick's first son arrived in 1906, they named him Winston Frederick Churchill Guest. Churchill was the boy's godfather. Amy moved into a world where the Churchills, the Guests, and the Phipps money converged at every dining table and country house weekend. She was, by documented account, a committed suffragist. She marched in demonstrations and served as vice president of South Florida's Equal Suffrage League. When the First World War came, she and Frederick donated their London home, Aldford House on Park Lane, to the American Red Cross for use as a naval hospital. John Singer Sargent had painted her portrait around the time of her 1905 wedding, the ultimate marker of Anglo-American social consequence in the Edwardian era. Sargent painted the people who mattered. He painted Amy Phipps Guest. Frederick was himself an early aviation enthusiast. He had been Secretary of State for Air, and in 1928 co-founded the British airfield operator National Flying Services. The household Amy had come from valued calculated ambition. The household she married into believed the future was always the next frontier. By the mid-1920s, Amy had developed her own serious passion for flight. When Charles Lindbergh completed his solo transatlantic crossing in May 1927, the question of who would be next and what records still remained unclaimed was alive in every aviation circle on both sides of the Atlantic. In early 1928, Amy Phipps Guest decided the answer was her. She would become the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. She acquired the Fokker F-7 tri-motor seaplane that had originally been ordered by Richard Byrd for his Antarctic expedition. Byrd had switched to a Ford tri-motor when Ford became a major sponsor and sold the Fokker to Jello heir Donald Woodward for $62,000. Woodward leased it to Amy. She renamed it Friendship. She assembled a crew and made her plans. Then her family found out. The exact conversations aren't in the record. What is in the record is the outcome. They forbade her to make the flight. A transatlantic crossing in 1928 was a genuinely lethal proposition. The Atlantic had already swallowed aircraft and crews attempting it. Amy was 55. The family's veto had a logic to it, however convenient that logic was for the men who delivered it. Amy's response wasn't to abandon the project. She funded it anyway, and instructed her organizers, publisher George Palmer Putnam and pilot recruiter Hilton Rayleigh, to find a suitable female pilot to take her seat. The directive, as it circulated among them, was to find the right sort of girl. That phrase carried precise intent. Amy wasn't looking for any pilot who happened to be female. She was looking for someone who would carry the weight of the moment, credible, accomplished, with the presence to represent what she believed aviation could be for women. Putnam and Rayleigh understood the specification. They interviewed candidates and landed on a 30-year-old social worker and pilot from Kansas, named Amelia Earhart, who had logged 500 hours in the air and owned 2 aircraft. Earhart received a phone call from Rayleigh in April 1928. The question was direct. Would you like to fly the Atlantic? She said yes. On June 17, 1928, the Friendship departed Trepassey, Newfoundland, with Earhart aboard alongside pilots Wilmer Stoltz and Lou Gordon. The tri-motor crossed the ocean in 20 hours and 40 minutes, landing at Buryport in Wales on June 18th. Earhart was honest with the press about her actual role when they arrived. Stoltz did all the flying. Had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. She hadn't touched the controls once during the entire crossing. None of that mattered to the newspapers. Amelia Earhart had crossed the Atlantic. Earhart was the story. When the Friendship crew reached Southampton, Amy Phipps Guest was on the dock. It was the first time she and Earhart had met in person. The woman who leased the airplane, named it, assembled the crew, absorbed the family prohibition, and financed the entire expedition, was standing at the water's edge while the crowd pressed around someone else. On July 6, 1928, Earhart received a ticker-tape parade through the Canyon of Heroes in New York City. Amy wasn't in the parade. Earhart acknowledged the sponsorship in her 1928 book, titled 20 Hours, 40 Minutes, the title taken directly from the flight's duration. The acknowledgement was genuine, and it was insufficient in the way footnotes are always insufficient. The New York Times had published a single sentence attributed to Amy on June 6, 1928, as the flight prepared. Mrs. Guest not only has a deep interest in aviation, but great faith in women as flyers. Reported in the third person. Her own statement about her own project, her own vision, her own money, written as if she were a bystander describing something that had happened to other people. Frederick Guest died of cancer on April 28, 1937, at 61. Amy survived him by 22 years. She maintained estates at Templeton and Villa Artemis in Old Westbury and Palm Beach, continued moving through the social world her wealth sustained, and watched as Amelia Earhart's name became permanent and her own became a research task. Earhart disappeared over the Pacific in July 1937, completing the transformation into legend. Amy Phipps Guest died on October 7, 1959, in Prangons, Switzerland, at 86. She was buried at Westbury Friends Cemetery in Westbury, New York. The fortune outlasted all of it. Bessemer Trust, which Henry Phipps established in 1907 to manage his $48 million payout and its subsequent growth, began as a single-family office. The name referenced the Bessemer process, the industrial method that had made Carnegie Steel competitive and, by extension, made the Phipps fortune possible. A name built from a technology, built on steel, built for children, whose names it would eventually outlive. By 1974, Bessemer Trust had developed enough institutional expertise to begin taking outside clients, expanding beyond the Phipps family into professional wealth management. Today, the firm oversees more than $200 billion in assets for over 3,000 families, foundations, and endowments, operating from 19 offices with headquarters in New York City. The great majority of its current clients couldn't tell you who Henry Phipps was. Fewer still could name his daughters. That's the mechanism of Gilded Age erasure, and it isn't dramatic. There was no single moment when Amy Phipps Guest was written out of the aviation story. No committee decided to omit Helen Phipps Martin from the architectural histories of Long Island. Carnegie attached his name to libraries and a concert hall on 57th Street in Manhattan. Morgan attached his name to a bank and a museum. Frederick Guest has a political biography that accurately records his years as Secretary of State for Air and his family connection to Churchill. Bradley Martin Jr.'s parents are immortalized by the most infamous party in Gilded Age New York. The women who married these men and the father who made the money all become subordinate clauses in other people's sentences, not through malice, but through the quiet arithmetic of who history decides to center. Amy and Helen were the daughters of a man whose defining public statement after the greatest business deal of his life was 4 words of deflection. Henry Phipps was the second largest shareholder in Carnegie Steel, and he appears in the histories of that era as a supporting figure in Carnegie's story. His daughters appear as supporting figures in their husbands' stories. Amy appears as a supporting figure in Earhart's story, the wealthy patron who made the famous thing possible and then stood on a dock watching it become famous without her. The Sargent portrait of Amy is real. Painted around 1905, it places her among the small exclusive circle of Anglo-American women Sargent considered worth the sitting. Astor wives, Vanderbilt daughters, duchesses. He painted Amy Phipps Guest. The portrait exists. The woman it captures, suffragist, aviation architect, wife of a Churchill cousin, daughter of Carnegie's quiet partner, requires a deliberate search to find. Knoll is subdivided. The friendship's route ends in a Welsh harbor. The steel mills that built the fortune became U.S. Steel, which became something else, which eventually became something else again. Bessemer Trust is still compounding, still operating, still bearing a name most people can't place. The money survived everything. The Carnegie Partnership, the Morgan buyout, the transatlantic marriages, the mansions, the women themselves. Amy Phipps Guest, Helen Phipps Martin. Their father helped build one of the greatest fortunes in American history. Now you know their names. Subscribe for more stories like this.